So thank you for joining us. In this panel, we will talk about the Swiss Responsible Business Initiative, and we will take this as an occasion to talk about the legal responsibility of transnational companies towards human rights and towards the environment. And this will be more of an informative event, so we will have a bit of a debate, but really the concentration is on informing or getting information about this very important topic. So the Responsible Business Initiative, the Swiss population will vote on the 29th of November. And this initiative wants Swiss-based companies to be legally obliged to incorporate respect for human rights and the environment in all of their business activities. So the companies must first review all their business relationships and activities and identify potential risks to the environment or to human rights. And they must take measures to address these potentially negative impacts. And they also must make a report on this, on any violations that they have identified, as well as on the related measures they have taken. So this is called a mandatory due diligence. And this will be also not only applied to the Swiss company, but also to their suppliers and their subsidiary companies who might be abroad. And if the companies do not comply, they will be liable under Swiss law. So this is the Responsible Business Initiative in brief. And I would now go more in details and ask our three panelists today to explain some more facts on this. So thank you very much to our three panelists for being here tonight. And in the first round, I would like to ask individual questions to one panelist without any repliques or interruptions by the other panelists. So these are informative questions to help us get into the topic. So I would like to start with Mr. Bartel, and I will introduce him. Mr. Bartel is a research collaborator. Maybe you can raise your hand so that we know who it is. Exactly, that's Mr. Bartel. He is a research collaborator at the Center for Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability of the University of Zurich. And he is also involved in research about multinational companies and their positive effects in developing countries. So in addition to these information, I also asked our panelists to share with us something that they enjoyed doing during their studies. And Mr. Bartel, he told me that he especially enjoyed hiking. So thank you for being with us today. As a first question to you, I would like to ask you, what is the status quo we have now in Switzerland with regard to corporate social responsibility and the legal responsibilities of multinational companies?
The status quo is that companies follow the Global Compact guidelines. These are guidelines that are crafted from a number of from 10 principles, ranging from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to international labor organizations and the Rio Declaration and so forth. And recently there was a Global Compact study review that showed that about 20% of Swiss companies, only 20% of Swiss companies do meet this the due diligence requirements of the Global Compact reporting guidelines.
Could you tell us some more about these Global Compact guidelines?
Well, the Global Compact guidelines have 10 principles, and they're derived, as I said, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Labor Organization. So when you discuss child labor, the definitions of child labor would be found in this declaration of the ILO declarations on the fundamental principles of rights and at work. There are environmental guidelines that are based on the Rio Declaration on environmental development. And then there are other United Nations conventions against corruption. I think one of the panelists would know more about that.
Thank you. So in the moment, is like being responsible, socially responsible, legally binding for firms in Switzerland? Does corporate social responsibility have to be a part of what multinational firms do?
At the moment, it's not legally binding, but if you enter into agreements with countries, sometimes you have an investment agreement, and there you could have aspects that might be legally binding.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to move on to our second panelist, Mr. Andreas Misbach. Maybe you could make yourself somehow remarkable. Yeah, thank you. Andreas Misbach is the Joint Managing Director of Public Eye, which is a human rights NGO. He's in the Department of Commodities, Trade and Finance. He is also a board member of the association who launched the Initiative for Responsible Businesses and a member of the official committee of the initiative. And during his studies, he enjoyed self-organized reading and discussion circles much more than the actual lectures. So thank you for being with us today. My question to you is, so Mr. Bartel told us a little bit about the status quo in the moment, and what would the Responsible Business Initiative want to change about this?
Well, let me start with a very concrete example. Glencore, Swiss commodities trading and producing company, they run an oil field in the south of Chad, and they store toxic wastewater in an open basin. That's a substandard practice. Normally, those wastewaters are reinjected into the ground. In September 2018, a basin burst and contaminated water poisoned a river. A river that was used by the inhabitants of the region for drinking, for washing, and also for their animals. So over 15 people from a nearby village reported injuries. Children as well as adults that bathed in the river, they had huge skin blisters, they had problems with their eyes, and goats, cows, pigs, and sheep died. So that's the kind of situation the initiative wants to prevent. It wants to prevent in the first place by making the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which is an internationally recognized soft law standard, mandatory for Swiss companies. So that mandatory human rights due diligence would mean, as you said, companies have to identify risk throughout their activities and supply chains. They have to act upon the risk they identified, and they have to report. That's the preventive part of the initiative, which is the core. And then in a situation like that, if a company neglectfully contributes or causes human rights violations, usually the subsidiary of a Swiss company in a foreign country. In that situation, the victims would have the chance to ask for a reparation of the damages in front of a Swiss court. But it's not something that they could just walk into the court and or just negligently or frivolous sue Swiss companies. No, they will have to provide that the damage occurred to them, that the damage was caused due to a human rights violation, that the subsidiary of the Swiss company caused the damage, and that the mother company of that subsidiary controls the subsidiary. So a very high level of things that have to be proven by victims. And after that, the company would still have the possibility to prove that it did everything that was required, that it did their due diligence. And only if it was not able to prove, because due diligence was not performed seriously, then the company will be liable.
Thank you very much. I will move on to our third panelist, Mrs. Dalia Palumbo. And she is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Business Ethics at the University of St. Gallen and a legal expert on business and human rights. And previously, she worked at the London School of Economics. This year, she published a book called Business and Human Rights, The Obligations of the European Home States. During her studies, she enjoyed international law, comparative law, human rights, and jurisprudence. And later on, she learned how to appreciate also researching on different fields, such as corporate law and tort law. So Dalia, I would like to ask you about this due diligence. So what exactly does it imply? Is it realistic to think that a victim, for example, one of the people, Mr. Misbach, mentioned, who bathed in the water, would actually manage to go to a Swiss court and sue a Swiss company? And how can this be guaranteed in case if the initiative does succeed?
Okay, so first of all, can you all hear me? All right, so thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm really glad to be here and to see so many students that are interested in this. I also feel that my co-panelists answer so much in such a nicer way than me about what they like during their studies. I also enjoy other things other than studying, but I thought the question was most focused on what I like to study. So to answer to your question, I have the privilege to be the third one, so I can also a little bit combine what you asked to the other panelists in my answer. I'd like first of all to say that they both focus very much on what are the international standards that companies have to follow in Switzerland. However, I'd like to mention that it's important to understand that this initiative regards some companies because in addition to the UNGPs, the Global Compact, all soft laws that companies may want to follow right now as the status quo is, there are obviously a lot of laws in Switzerland in terms of how companies should behave in Switzerland. So it is obvious that the situation that was described before, that's a very realistic situation that happens all the time when we talk about huge transnational groups, will not happen to communities living nearby the St. Gallen River, right? The river close to St. Gallen, because there are rules that can be enforced here. Now, the problem is when we have multinational enterprises, what happens is that they are incorporated by their own nature in a number of different countries. Each company is a separate legal entity. No company is responsible for what others companies are doing as a general basis. And that's the problem, because if you fragment your liability as a group, so that, for instance, the company in any country, we can say in Switzerland, a company, I'm Italian, I'll use my country, in Italy, a company in Nigeria, a company wherever it is, has only a fraction of liability for what it's doing, this becomes extremely complicated. Then there are other issues in terms of for victims to actually obtain effective remedies against these companies, because in addition to the fragmentation of liability, there is also an issue of extraterritoriality. Which court has jurisdiction for this kind of torts that are extraterritorial? What kind of law we can apply? So even if you are not an expert in a legal expert, you can understand that there is a lot of burden on victims, to answer to your question currently, in terms of allowing them to sue a company that is damaging their interest. So if all of this would happen with a Swiss company in Switzerland, producing anything in Switzerland, this will not be a problem. The problem is when we get to this transnational dimension. In this sense, the problem is that when we get to this transnational dimension, all we have is what the other panelists mentioned, soft law at the international level that is applicable against companies. So there are two different avenues one can take here. One is to say, okay, let's have an international framework binding on multinationals. Now, it's a good idea, but it has never worked. So essentially, there have been a lot of attempts to create these frameworks to allow victims to actually sue companies at the international level and to create international obligations. But this has not been successful in the past. And currently in the UN, there are discussions of a treaty that is still not including responsibilities, international legal obligations for businesses. So the other option you have is to allow states to apply their laws extraterritorially. And that is why this responsible business initiative is attempting to do. It's attempting to create an obligation for Swiss companies, so for company incorporated in Switzerland, that would be applicable extraterritorially also when such companies abuse human rights and environmental standards abroad through their subsidiaries or supply chains. So I think that this is in a common thread that we see all over Europe. So it's not the first initiative, there has been others, and there are even countries that have already adopted such law. And I think this law, specifically this proposal, is extremely good in this sense. So I do think that it would create substantial avenues for victims to obtain effective remedies. If this is really going to work in practice, we have to see, because we also have to remember that this is a constitutional framework in this initiative, but then we will have to see how this is applicable in practice. And to see this, we need first to see this referendum. Only if this referendum actually passed, we can see how this develops further. But it's definitely a very good start.
Thank you very much. And for those explanations. Of course, you also made us curious now. So what else did you enjoy during your studies, except the actual studies?
Oh, many things. I mean, skiing, hiking, figure skating, going to the theater, going to cafes. So I have a long list, but I would say sport the most. I love sports.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's get back to the topic now. So after this first round of individual questions, I would like to ask questions that are meant for all of the panelists. So you can feel free to reply. You can either just start talking or raise your hand if you feel the need, but I think we are just three panelists, so it should be manageable if we have like a discussion setting.
Can I just say something very quickly on that? Because I think it was in 2013 that CNPC, that's the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation that operates in Chad, had some issues with pollution. And I think the Chadian government was able to get in some expertise to investigate that and actually kicked out CNPC. Many years later, of course, they came back. But of course, there are, a country has some clout to do that. And CNPC is just as huge, maybe even bigger than Glencore. So at least there is that possibility for a country to do that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other remarks on what the other panelists have said?
No, I think I'll just have as a follow-up to the other implications, because it is very straightforward if depending on the sector, if we take mining or oil companies, the value chains are very short, especially for in the case of African countries, where basically you work with contractors and so forth. So The biggest problem there, of course, is pollution. And I come from South Sudan. We have huge issues with pollution by the Chinese company. Yeah, it is very difficult for the locals to get remedy. But one complicating factor is also what kind of government one has in power, because this is an agreement between the government and a foreign entity. The National Petroleum Agency, the government holds shares in that agency and has some obligation to its citizens. So one has to find the balance between what kind of agreements these states are making or striking with foreign companies also.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you yourself did research on also the positive impacts that multinational companies can have.
Yeah, we have a project which I did with a number of companies, and actually the 2017-2018 reports by Chiquita are based on this concept of embeddedness. So we see that if a company is embedded in the local, the degree of embeddedness of a company in a local community reflects on the kind of positive externalities that it creates on those communities. For most of these mining and oil companies, of course, they have an area which is secure, and there is less interaction with the overall community, or it is basically footloose, disconnected with the local communities. So I would say, they could be less embedded. So we have to look at their responsibility on other aspects, maybe environmental, but also on the kind of taxation and how much they are contributing to the national income of the country. But then at the end of the day, it's also how effective the authorities are in translating that into development or sustainable development. So,
if I may quickly react. Yes, I mean, I fully agree, and this is what I witnessed, for example, in Zambia. A total separation of two worlds between the mining company and then the fence and their security guards, and on the other side, the impoverished community, except for the fact that the communities are impacted by the emissions created at the mine. And of course, it would always be preferable if victims can claim for reparation in the country where the damage occurred directly, suing the subsidiary of a Swiss multinational that caused the damage. Unfortunately, there are many countries in the world where this is not possible. Not so much actually because laws are not in place, but because they're not implemented and the justice system is not accessible for victims. And for those situations, it is so important that victims have another avenue to go directly to pierce that corporate way, or that illusion. In the end, it's an illusion that the companies are separate entities, because in fact, economically, they're consolidated, and the profits, they flow from the subsidiary to the headquarter. So why shouldn't the responsibility also rest with the headquarter? And for a situation where it's not possible to get reparation, to get the right in the country, then the responsible business initiative is needed in those situations.
Can I also react to actually both comments? So for what Konstantin said, I think like the response, it's absolutely right that companies have in general a positive impact, and actually nobody, I think, would say from any of these initiatives, the Swiss one or others in other countries, that companies don't have a positive impact. To the contrary, I think these initiatives are actually helping those companies that are taking a socially responsible lead. Because you see, when you are trying to ensure that there is respect of human rights or environmental standards in your supply chain as a socially responsible company, and your competitor actually is completely disregarding this because it has no obligation to do so, then you're not helping those companies that have a positive impact on communities that they affect, but you're actually helping those companies that don't. Because what these initiatives are doing are requiring the respect of minimum standards. So that would create a minimum level of do no harm all over the supply chains. And for those companies that want to do more, that would actually help them out because their competitors will not be able to lower the cost so much. So I think this would actually help companies that are already acting on a voluntary basis in a socially responsible way. The other thing that I wanted to say is that the other point concerning whether these victims should sue in what is called the host state, so where the subsidiaries. I think that's obviously the case, and I think that these initiatives are not limiting the possibility for victims to sue in the host state. Actually, victims sometimes manage to sue in the host state, but there are a lot of complications. So I'll just mention two. One is limited liability. So sometimes they sue in the host state, but in the host state, that company doesn't have enough assets to repay the victim. So this is a real problem. A lot of companies are undercapitalized or have contractual relationship with companies that don't have the money to repay the victims, and it's very clear what they do so because they want to limit their liability. It's a privilege they have by law, so why wouldn't they use it? And the other question is which was also debated, for instance, in the treaty negotiation at the UN, is investment agreements. Investment agreements are actually that states have in between themselves are actually sometimes preventing the possibility for victims to obtain effective remedies in host states. So because of all of that, I think that establishing this possibility for victims to sue in the home state would only allow them to have this route, which in any case, they will take only when nothing else is available, because it's very clear that if I am in Ghana and my rights are violated in Ghana and I have a possibility to sue the company and to obtain reparation there, I won't go to Switzerland. It's clear, right? I'll do this only if this doesn't work. So really, these initiatives are aimed at closing the gaps that are created, the accountability gap that it's so widely discussed, that are created by the regulatory framework of transnational enterprises.
At the same time, this initiative, it would be unique, I think, to Switzerland, and it would be unique to Switzerland in regard to laws for responsible business. And for example, if there would be a village which has a German company on the one side polluting its air and the Swiss company on the other side polluting its air, it would imply different rules. So they could maybe sue the Swiss company, but not the German company. How would this uniqueness, do you think this uniqueness would be more, it could also be seen as a sign of quality or a positive sign? Do you think this would be an advantage or a disadvantage for Swiss companies?
So just, I'm not sure if you're asking this to me or like.
It can be anyone. It's open to anyone.
I'm just gonna answer because it's a short answer here. So first of all, this is not unique. France has already adopted a similar law. There is a discussion to adopt, the Netherlands have adopted a law that is a little bit different, but on the same note. There is a discussion now at the European level to adopt a mandatory due diligence law at the EU level, which would cover, for example, German companies. And in addition to this, again, you need to consider what kind of companies are you helping? Because, of course, let's go out of the European Union, there are no this kind of initiative. So you may say, you have a Swiss company polluting, and nearby you have, I don't know, an American company polluting, and you say, okay, so the Swiss company can be in a disadvantage in comparison to the American company. But what about the Swiss companies that are at home in Switzerland who are actually following all that rule? You are going to put them as a disadvantage with any other company that is causing this kind of damages. So I think that it's not fair to consider it this way, because you're not considering also all the other companies that are part of this discussion. But at the European level, this is not unique. It is unique of Europe. I would say that it is quite unique of Europe. There is also another thing to consider. There are countries in which there is no discussion on such laws, but there are jurisprudential trends that are extremely positive. For example, Canada is one of them. Also in the UK, there have been promising cases using the duty of care, so not a mandatory due diligence law, but a case law analysis to actually establish jurisdiction for these cases. So it's clearly not unique.
Okay, Mr. Bartel or Mr. Misbach, would you like to react on this?
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned, you know, the kind of companies and the like. So if I were to look at this discussion from a developing country, you know, a policymaker in a developing country that is trying to plan its economy, this is something that is cross-cutting. We talk about Glencore, but the economy is much bigger than you know, the energy sector. So I am looking at other aspects, how this will also involve other sectors, especially Article 101. You know, how does that affect a firm, a subsidiary that is not owned by a Swiss-based company and is a supplier, for example? You know, and I am here trying to diversify my economy, trying to link up to Swiss companies, not just in other sectors, in the agri sector, in the food sector. And I cannot control everything, you know, given the kind of challenging business environment where sometimes, you know, child labor is rampant. How does this help me, or how does this impact on other on these other sectors? That's why from that perspective, I think that at the national level, for me, I would tend to prefer efforts that focus on, you know, on taking local businesses to their next level, you know, through partnerships, through continuous learning, through innovation. But every time we move this to just one sector and one company, it doesn't make sense for, you know, the bigger picture in terms of other sectors. I would like to diversify my economy. It's not just, and there are about 5 countries in Africa that, in the continent, that are resource rich. And we are going to have a measure that is going to affect business linkages and value chains across the road, across the sector. So that is where I'm struggling, and the question of the reversal of burden of proof, you know, at the end of that, that question basically would like companies to prove that they have done reasonable due diligence. The question then is, what is reasonable? Because now we have seen that 20% of Swiss companies, only 20% have done this due diligence. And ironically, the companies that are most under attack in this campaign are those that have fulfilled most of these obligations. Well, there are issues. I'm not saying there are no issues. There are issues. If you're such a big company, there are issues. But these obligations, if you look at the studies and see who have done more in terms of due diligence, it is the guys with who have available cash. Smaller companies, I'll give a very simple example where with a Swiss company in Basel, in a village in Basel, who produces water purification material, we tried to set up a company with a Swiss investment, and this measure will not affect the direct production of purification of that water, but we had an idea that along the value chain we would use the street kids. These are kids that are sleeping on sleeping rough. They sniff glue to go to sleep because they couldn't eat. So with such an initiative, the moment we include these guys in the distribution chain, you know, we would actually be breaking one of the child labor rules, because we are not letting them go to school. And that's why I think there are other measures that one can put in place. And for countries that are already so small and so vulnerable, you know, many of these companies are bigger than 3, 4, 5 African states put together. You know, so the only way to get some leverage is through the multilateral channels. Just like you would say, okay, you know, we can take you to court to Switzerland. You should also be able to get leverage through all these multilateral channels to develop your own economy in other sectors. So for companies that don't have let's say mining or are not in no crude oil, they would need other sectors in the Swiss economy to develop, and there you will find child labor, you will find other abuses, because we are talking of economies that are 50 to 90% informal. So in terms of European thinking, you can think of a gig economy, except that these are small firms that, you know, small traders working on harmful environments, unregulated markets. In terms of law and practice, they are not covered by formal arrangements. So, and that's why it would be better, it would be good to look at where is the baseline once companies come in, and then what is it that they can improve and take it from there. In the oil industry, of course, you know, things can be much more clearer, but in the rest of the economy, I think it will be a burden to develop or diversify the economy, because it's basically adding a little bit more of uncertainty.
Thank you very much. Maybe Mr. Misbach would like to.
Yes.
Misbach would like to react on that.
Yes, I mean, first of all, it's not what is important to stress, because it's constantly misrepresented in the debate now, is that the liability is not through the supply chain. Only due diligence requirement is covers the supply chain, which is the international standard. It's not an invention by the initiative, and as has been said, it's the trend that this will be mandatory at least across Europe. And so there is no reason, which is also sometimes misrepresented, that then actually Swiss companies would cut ties from suppliers. There is no need for that, because they won't be liable for things that occur in their supply
that's
chain.
what it says. That's what it says in the article.
No, that's not the case. It's simply not the case.
That is the most important part of the.
No, sorry, it's not the case. It's not the case in the text of the initiative. It's not.
Well,
and
it's just been written out that the subsidiaries, you have to do due diligence with the subsidiaries, and if not, you will be liable.
Yeah, subsidiaries is something different, because subsidiaries are controlled by the Swiss company. But now we are talking about supply chains and suppliers, and there is no liability for the suppliers. And
could you maybe stress the difference between what is the difference between suppliers and subsidiaries?
A subsidiary is basically a company that are owned by a Swiss headquarter. So let me say, sorry again, in the extractive sectors, if Glencore runs a mine, it's a local company under local law in Zambia, but it is owned and controlled by Glencore. It's part of their consolidated accounts and everything. So that's a subsidiary, a daughter company. And the supply chain is anyone that sells to a Swiss company. And so there's absolutely no need, because of the initiative, to cut ties with suppliers. Not. On the contrary, what the UN Guiding Principles ask from companies, and that's what will become mandatory, is that they actually engage throughout their supply chain, that they engage with suppliers if there's a risk, if there is a problem, that they engage with suppliers to improve improve the situations and minimize the human rights risks. And here I would like to cite what Kobina Awua. He's a Ghanaian investor, and he said that there are a lot of advantages if that law is implemented, because that corporations, they are looking for responsible supply chains. So they will invest in supply chains. They will support their suppliers. They will help them to meet the international standards, and that is actually benefiting African companies that are part of multinational supply chains. So there is no negative effect on those companies. And of course, when you talk about the informal economy, I mean, I know the great majority of businesses in Africa are in the informal sector. Very few of them have ties to multinational companies. And of course, an initiative like this won't solve those problems. We have to be very clear about that. It's an initiative that tackles some problems caused by globalization, caused by the disconnect between the global reach of multinationals and the legal framework that governs them. But there are many, many other problems that have to be tackled through other avenues. And yeah.
So how
can I just add some? Oh, sorry.
Well, that brings also the question of child labor. So if informal sector is not involved in this value chain, so there are no child, there wouldn't be child labor too. So, but anyway, the consequences the consequences are different from my perspective, because if there is a law like this and you would like to avoid being sued, companies have can do something else. Multinationals can make it easy for themselves. They could replace whatever local suppliers are there with, say, international contractors who would easily just maintain the standards. And you don't have a problem with that, but I do have a problem with that, because I would like to see basically companies, the locals, turning into the suppliers, and not, you know, the international contractors or something like that. The other practice in Africa is that in most developing countries is that companies can decide to operate from secluded export processing zones. You know, it's really nice, clean, well organized, but this has little backward linkages to the domestic economy. So you have these islands of production not embedded in the economy, and in the long term, it just becomes much more difficult for the guys in the informal economy, who actually make up to 90% of the economy. Some of them, just because they are not regulated or registered, you know, these are jobs. They are providing jobs to their families. They make sure that you know, that people survive. They make sure that, you know, young people don't think of maybe immigrating or something like that. But at the end, I'm much more concerned about linking whatever investment is there to these backward linkages with this informal sector. That is what happened in Malaysia. It can happen in Africa. There are talented young entrepreneurs who would want to do that. And I would rather have this investment go to this young generation. The negative consequences are much more serious for me in terms of this limiting knowledge transfer and inclusive growth.
So we see that the initiative obviously might have effect on Swiss firms, but also on supplying firms, on the local people in other countries, and it has many different implications. Mrs. Palumbo, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say one thing. I don't think, I mean, if I understood correctly, and maybe I misunderstood, but an attractiveness of one country would be to offer the possibility to have child labor. And I think that if this is what a country has to offer to a multinational enterprise, maybe it's better that it's pushed to offer something else. And the reason for that is that we are just going for a race to the bottom here. Like the standards are becoming lower and lower and lower. And this, I think, in the long term will not benefit anyone. There's also another point that nobody's forcing companies that are in any country to follow these rules. These rules would force only companies that are Swiss, like it is already the case in France, companies that are French, to avoid taking the advantage of having the headquarters in France, but everything else made in 50 other countries. So it will not prevent any local business from violating human rights. This is the burden of those co-states, so of each state. And each state has this obligation, by the way, to ensure that its companies incorporated in its country do not abuse human rights. So we are not talking about something that it's an additional burden. We're talking about something that should already be embedded in the law. In addition, I just would like to say, France has just passed a law that is very similar to the Swiss one. And I don't think that French multinationals have stopped investing in developing countries. So I really don't see, because there may be the possibility that if they violate human rights, maybe the victims will file a complaint in France. I mean, this is not happening that often. So I think this is really creating just a minimum standard, really a minimum level. And the French law, it's a good example of the fact that nobody has escaped from, that I know there are no French companies that have escaped from developing countries because of this law.
Mm-hmm. And there is actually a question from the from in the chat, which goes a bit in that direction. I wanted to keep the questions from the public to the end, but since we're already at this topic, Karim Benanza asked in the chat that he asked the question, to what extent is the risk of multinationals shifting their place of business to minimize judicial risk present?
Well, the question is, I'm not
Thank
sure.
Thank you for the question, Karim.
Thanks a lot.
I didn't get the question either.
I'm not sure if the question refers to that the multinationals would move the headquarters out of Switzerland. Was that the question?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Or
well,
yeah.
I don't think that the risk is very high, and for the simple reason that Switzerland offers so much to multinational corporations. It's a very good. I mean, there are so many advantages: tax, security, very high educated labor force, and so on and so forth. So it would basically mean if a company would actually leave Switzerland because of this law, it would mean that the business model of that company is violating human rights or environmental standards. And I think there are very few such companies. And if there are some, then we would certainly not be missing them. But for all the other multinational companies, there is no need to leave Switzerland. And over time, it would actually also be difficult to leave, to go somewhere else where they don't have similar rules, because as has been said, it's an international trend, at least across Europe, that will become the new normal.
Just two things to clarify. You talked about the race to the bottom. I don't think that's not what I meant. I said what I meant was that if the argument is that it has to do with subsidiaries, and in those subsidiaries there are no locals, no child labor, so this shouldn't be an issue. Yeah. So because the subsidiaries, would be meeting all the standards, so the argument that child labor is an issue is not the problem. It's also about the kind of companies, the kind of French companies in French-speaking countries, and the whole the political economy of those countries is completely different. Swiss companies venture alone, almost, with the help of maybe the embassy, but not the state apparatus behind them. So I need to look at this French law, and I try to invest in Chad. I had some dealings with French companies. They also have the same, the road builders are either subsidiaries but I think you know that better than I do. But it's not also something that is just that has to do with developing countries. If you look at what is happening today in the Netherlands with Tata, it's a huge problem, a huge health problem. This is a developed country, and there are other issues. The Dutch government or the municipality has other issues to weigh in terms of the health of its population, and so it's not just a north-south issue. And if you look at the arguments there, you might find that the best approach for a very small countries, not economically that powerful, can get their arms twisted, is a multilateral approach. A multilateral approach in terms of looking at the guidelines. The Swiss National Action Plan already, is a good indicator whereby the Swiss Federal Administration has to regularly review progress in the implementation of the guidelines on business and human rights. There is a lot to do where countries can pressure, create alliances that promote corporate accountability with multi-stakeholder engagement. For countries that don't have that clout, this is a good avenue. There is a whole range of non-judicial mechanisms, state-based non-judicial mechanisms that are weak in most of these developing countries. For me, they are much quicker and cheaper route to solve business and human rights complaints instead of waiting for many years before you hear outcomes. So I would think that we should not lose sight of this kind of mechanisms that would help, create, build the capacities of many national administrations, civil society, to be the watchful eyes of companies in their communities, and many NGOs, I think, are doing that, and it is slow, but I'm just hoping that this is not going to overshadow, come up with one rule that basically targets one or two companies, but we have all this diversification, economic diversification agenda to deal with. So isn't there another way of addressing this special issue without having all of these kind of implications where it is a much more costly to link with multinational companies or larger companies, especially SMEs. My partner wasn't a multinational company, but was a small company in Switzerland. So
thank you for raising this question also. With a look at the time, we would like to go to a final round and then open the questions to the audience.
I would just
yes.
If I may just quickly react to that, because actually we have been involved in the development of the Swiss National Action Plan. We have been in constant exchange with the federal administration.
If you say we, who do you mean exactly?
Public Eye and other civil society organizations that are now also sponsors of the initiative. And in the end, we had to conclude, well, there is no plan and there is no real plan and definitely no action. It's not the case that Switzerland is monitoring the human rights performance of Swiss-based companies. It's simply not the case. They write reports from time to time, but there is no constant monitoring. There is no implementation. That was one of our demands, that there would be a process where companies are monitored and compared and assessed, and this is not the case. So we cannot rely on those voluntary measures. They simply don't work. Voluntarism does not work in that area. And that was precisely years of voluntary actions that did not deliver, that did not prevent human rights violations from happening. That's the reason why this initiative has been launched. And that's also the reason why the discussions are going on the EU level. Same with the voluntary mechanisms that exist for conflict resolutions, like the OSD contact point for multinational corporations. That is a voluntary mechanism that exists in Switzerland, where you can file a complaint against a multinational company. But what happens then? There is a mediation, and that is organized by the federal administration. So you sit next to the multinational company and you can discuss issues. But if the company doesn't want to act, nothing happens. There isn't even an assessment if the company breached minimal standards. And certainly there is no way to get remedy. So what we have currently in place in terms of voluntary mechanism does not deliver in terms of prevention of human rights violations, and it does not deliver at all in terms of providing remedy to victims.
I can.
So this, yeah, just sorry.
Just one small
Okay.
thing that would complement this. Just one thing. I think very simply that voluntary measures are wonderful for what they are. They're voluntary measures. They are establishing standards to help companies to do better. And they help mediation, confrontation between people and companies. And they are very welcome. There have been, I think it's 20 years that the voluntary measures are ongoing, and they should continue, and they complement the law. I mean, nobody would say that, you know, because there are good standards for companies, that you wouldn't sign a contract actually in law with a company if you need to have a commercial relationship with that, because you'll just rely on voluntary measures. That's the same thing. You may sign a contract with a company, you may have a legal a regulation of your activities by law, and to the side, there will be standards that explain what is the best practice. I don't think that one excludes the other one. I think they complement each other. We do have the soft law measure, and I think it's very important that they were mentioned, but we also need legal rules that establish not the best practice, the minimum practice, the worst practice that you should follow. We need that minimum, not only the best, because not everybody can follow the best, but we need to make sure that everyone follow a minimum.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very nice kind of semi-closing word for this round, because there, as Mr. Bartel says, maybe there's, I mean, there are different, might there be different solutions to this issue? And there are always, we can see there are always different solutions to one problem. And maybe there's not one right or one wrong solution, but there are different possible solutions. I would also like to mention that the Swiss Parliament has suggests a counter proposal to this initiative in case this initiative is rejected. The counter proposal which would come into place is that Swiss companies would be required to issue a non-financial report. Companies trading conflict minerals or offering goods or services where there's a reasonable suspicion of child labor would have to perform additional due diligence, but there would be no new liability rules. So this is also another suggestion to find a solution to this problem. I would like to ask the audience now, are there any questions that you would like to ask our panelists? You can either write them in the chat or turn on your video and ask the question. Okay, seems good. seems bad. I don't know.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. What do you think about the counter project? Actually,
okay.
Yes, I think it's not a counter project to the initiative. It's a trick, a gimmick, trying to confuse voters in order to achieve that the initiative is rejected. There was, for a long time, there was a discussion in the parliament about the real counter proposal. And the indirect counter proposal, the concept of an indirect counter proposal is basically that the parliament, when faced with an initiative, they, without waiting for the initiative to be voted, they design laws that take a reasonable amount of what the initiative wanted to achieve and put them already into law with the aim that then the initiative is taken back. So, and what we had in the National Council was something like that. It would have been acceptable for us to take the initiative back, us, the initiative committee, if that had passed. It was a compromise. Now, that was killed in the Council of States, and what was introduced there, what is now called counter proposal, has almost nothing to do with the initiative. It's a pure reporting requirement. So in the end, we would get another round of glossy reports, more glossy sustainability reports. But that's the approach that has been used in the European Union since 2014 and has not delivered anything with regards to solution of the problem. So just reporting without the requirement of due diligence just doesn't work. And when it comes to the tiny parts where there is due diligence, like conflict minerals or child labor, I mean, conflict minerals is limited to 4 minerals. But at the same time, you have, for example, cobalt, which is one of the most important minerals that is used for electric vehicles. It's produced in Congo under very difficult situations, but it's not considered a conflict mineral, so nothing would happen. Same with child labor. I mean, what do you say to a victim that has to a 17-year-old that just had, I don't know, been his arm injured while working for a multinational company? Sorry, we can't do anything for you because you're already 17, you're not covered. And apart from that, there is no legal liability attached to even that, to that limited due diligence requirement. So it's don't let you be fooled. This is not a counter proposal. This is the status quo of the European Union of 2017-18, and it will not resolve any of the problems.
Thank you, Mr. Misbach. We have 2 other questions. Maybe we can ask the other panelists to answer these. So the next one is from Simone. I'm afraid that companies will try to supposedly fulfill their duty of care by contracts or declarations, but actually maintain the status quo through financial pressure and exploitation. How far will a reversal of evidence be able to prevent this?
Maybe I can take this one.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for your question. I think that for sure, look, once the law will be established, and I would like to stress that this is a constitutional change, and then there will be more to get the details. So there are some questions that we're not able to answer now as to how in practice this will work, because a lot will be in how this is structured in the end. And of course, once there will be a law, companies will try to study ways to go around it. However, what I can say is that this is a strong law, and it's clearly establishing a good framework for victims to file complaints. The reason for that is because, as it was mentioned before, victims will have to file lawsuits against the holding or parent companies. They will have to demonstrate that the subsidiary violated human rights, that there was this relationship of control. But then if they demonstrate this, they don't also have to demonstrate a direct intervention of the parent company in the action of the subsidiary. It's enough to demonstrate that that parent company was controlling the subsidiary. So this is already a good thing in comparison to, for example, other laws that we can think about. So it's not really a reversal of the burden of proof, it's a split of the burden of proof. So the victims still have to prove a lot of things, as I said, but then the parent company has the possibility to actually prove that it did everything it could. It adopted reasonable due diligence to actually prevent that human rights or environmental abuse. I think this is a very balanced approach, because obviously parent companies will have much more information than the victims. So they will be able to prove that they put in place their due diligence. While one of the things that we can see in other countries, for example, I'm thinking about the UK, it's hard for victims to prove what is the actual action of parent companies on what the group did, because they don't have the information, and they often have to wait for disclosure, and it's kind of quite long. So this is a good thing. So to answer, I can't promise, and I don't know if this is really going to work, and I cannot tell that this is for sure going to be an effective remedies to victims. However, this is a good step in the right direction. So definitely it would help victims.
Thank you. So we have 3 final questions. The next one is, It is also in the legal domain. So how can Switzerland prosecute criminal acts committed abroad? Isn't this a territorial jurisdiction? Isn't territorial jurisdiction breached?
Maybe I can start with that. I think, and then you will continue with, because I'm not a lawyer. But I think the most important thing here is it's not about criminal law. It's about civil law. So it's sometimes it's often heard, how can a local court in Switzerland decide on such difficult matters? Should a Swiss prosecutor then go to where the damage happened? In civil law, it doesn't work like this. It's the, as has been said, it's the victim that has to prove the evidence. It's paper, it's documentation, it's medical records, those kind of things, and that's absolutely normal. That already happens. That it is absolutely normal that this cross country jurisdictions. I mean, if I'm on holiday in, let's say, Egypt, and I have a car accident where a German person is injured, then you have an international liability situation. So that's something courts are used to deal with. And actually, with regards to criminal law, it's even better established. I mean, when it comes to corruption, it's normal that Swiss court, now we are really in the criminal area, decide on acts that have happened abroad, that Swiss companies committed abroad, if they bribed a foreign public official. Same with, for example, child abuse, sexual child abuse. It doesn't matter if that happened in another country. An individual that committed that will be prosecuted in Switzerland.
Thank you. Dalia, would you like to add something, or?
I just wanted to add that, of course, this issue of jurisdiction, it's generally a question when you have extraterritorial cases. However, these extraterritorial cases are more and more common in a globalized kind of type of economy. So obviously, there is a Swiss element here. There is a Swiss company. So we're not talking about a state establishing jurisdiction over a foreign entity. The responsibility would be the responsibility of the Swiss company for what its corporate group does. So the jurisdiction is established on the Swiss company.
Okay, thank you. I heard from the team that somebody raised their hand in the video or might like to ask a question through the mic.
Yes, thank you very much. I would have a question to Dr. Palumbo, since you mentioned that it's mainly European countries actually that have been trying to develop and to implement systems, as you said, whereby companies are held in check, so to speak, by their respective jurisdiction. So my question would be, doesn't this kind of trends have the danger or the risk of putting in place some sort of outsourcing of justice by developing countries, which in the end would have, I think, detrimental effects to the development of, well, not only a human rights regime, but good practices when it comes to the implementation of human rights. So, for example, actually bringing claims to court.
So this is an excellent question. Thank you very much for it. Okay, I have to take a step back here to answer. So I would say that in an ideal world, I would recommend having an international treaty with obligations for corporations. And that was actually what, if you, as I mentioned before, that there is a UN treaty negotiation ongoing. That was actually proposed by a number of developing countries as a treaty on the obligations and accountability of transnational enterprises. So at this point, you would avoid this problem of outsourcing justice somehow, because everything would be done at the transnational level. However, this was also, by the way, a proposal by a number of NGOs. However, this doesn't seem to be successful. There have been also another attempt to establish a treaty in the past that was not successful. And in this negotiation, it hasn't been successful. So all the drafts we have of the treaty are somehow a compromise. And what they do is that each country would have to hold to account their own companies, and they would all have to act extraterritorially and mutually cooperate in cases of transnational abuses. So essentially, I think that can be a danger if only developed countries would establish these rules and that's it. But if this is done in cooperation with other countries, and the treaty points at that, I think this is the only instrument we have, the realistic instrument we have to tackle abuses. So the idea would be that different countries in the world establish different rules in their own jurisdiction. And when there is a transnational element, you have a number of extraterritorial possibilities for the victims and a cooperation between the different countries. I think that if we look at a possible future like this, it looks good. And it also has another advantage in comparison to the transnational idea to have a treaty at the international level, that obviously domestic laws are much better in terms of holding to account anyone, both in developing and developed countries, because they are made to be used against private persons, whether companies or people, while having something at the international level, although would be somehow, would address this problem of extraterritoriality in a more radical way, it would also create the issue that how do we act against companies that are not states? So in this sense, I think that because this is in a global trend, this kind of laws will inform the treaty negotiation, and the treaty negotiation is informing this kind of laws. And this can actually bring to a very positive development of mutual cooperation between different countries.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lorenzo, also for your question. So because of the time, we have a few minutes left only and 2 more questions. So maybe I would like to ask our panelists to answer these questions rather briefly. So one question is from Elena. Can this initiative weaken the legal system in other countries, which Elena has heard on an argument in a discussion of the Swiss radio and TV broadcasting system?
Well, I would like to agree that the application of pressures through mechanisms that generate, this progressive change within the broader social and political institutions in the country would be preferable, at least for these countries, because one of the problems in developing countries is the lack of capacities to monitor, to prosecute. If today, in the last UN report, we see that illicit financial flows is robbing the continent of something like $89 billion. This is, and 77% of that is from illegal gold mines. This is $89 billion every year. And these are going through countries that don't even have don't have mines or considerable mines like Libya, Uganda, and so forth. So the continent is being robbed, and it does not have capacity to deal with this illicit trade in minerals. So, and if we can come up with mechanisms that can help these countries to solve some of these issues, that would be my preference, instead of trying to solve a little part of the problem that has to do with a company here, but the bigger picture of billions of dollars being lost. I know Public Eye has prosecuted a number of cases in Swiss courts that were very successful. But the thing is, while you celebrate that success of prosecuting illegal acts of corruption linked to, for example, Congo, the institutions of Congo, nothing happens. You know, the same dealings just continue with maybe other people with much better connections, maybe with other states, and we see countries exporting minerals that they don't have in their countries. You know, why? Because the judicial system, the countries don't have these capacities to do all of this. Now we can talk about child labor, we can talk about all these issues, but it comes down to, you know, the biggest problem, and that is poverty. Yeah. So once we try to look at this, at solving these issues on the long term, for the long term, I think there are mechanisms that that could be put in place. I guess Public Eye and others have been pushing the government, but I don't know how concerted an effort was that with partners in the South, and also the governments. I know, for example, that there was in 1970 there's this convention to collect evidence on civil and commercial matters. Only South Africa has capacities to do that and have signed agreements with others, but most of the African continent is blank, and that's why we get to do with an NGO trying to document evidence of child labor, a minister coming over to say, no, this is not true, it is staged, because we don't have those capacities. So I would rather hope that this kind of approach, where you build the capacities, have real partners to resolve these issues, to take people to court at the, in the country, it's possible. As I said in the beginning, Chad basically kicked out a Chinese oil company because of polluting. In South Sudan, Glencore was a marketing partner of the national oil company, but because of the corruption, the Americans basically put sanctions on the company, and Glencore had to leave. Just imagine that this national oil company had a diversified portfolio. It would have damaged the rest of the businesses down and upstream. So that's why I would think that perhaps a better approach would be to strengthen the alternative. What was it? What the state government? The counter proposal. Maybe look at that. Try to strengthen that, and and basically take into consideration what does this happen. What happens to maybe a country that would like to diversify its economy, not with Glencore, but with other Swiss SMEs and other businesses. But that's my humble, take.
Thank you very much. So we have two more questions that go, I think they go broadly into the same direction of what happens in the developing countries if this initiative comes to place. But due to the time, I think we really should close the panel right now. I think the initiative it's called Responsible Business Initiative, and it also, we have seen in the discussion, touches many different issues that there are in the current economy in our world that we live in. Problems such as child labor or poverty, development, good government, corruption, and these are all interrelated. And this initiative is not a solution to solve all the problems in the world. It's a solution to tackle one specific issue. And obviously we need lots of more solutions and lots of more ideas to tackle problems such as development and diversification, and poverty and child labor. This is not just one thing that will solve everything, but it is an idea, and with the Swiss population will decide on it by the end of this month. So I really, really would like to thank our panelists, Mr. Bartel, Mrs. Palumbo, and Mr. Misbach, for taking the time to be with us this evening. And I also thank all the audience for attending, and also the people who asked questions. I'm very sorry for the two last questions we didn't have time to deal with in detail, but I hope that the closing words somehow went into that direction. I would like to give over to Connecting to officially close the panel. And from my side, I say goodbye and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank